How much could an invasion of Rafah cost Israel? Marking unusually strong criticism, the U.S. is warning its ally not to invade Rafah and to extract its troops from Gaza. Without credible post-war plans, the U.S. says Israel is poised to do terrible harm. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has pledged to press on and go it alone if necessary. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Rafah. For weeks now, Israel has been threatening to launch an all-out attack on Rafah. Last week, Israeli forces took control of the Rafah border crossing and much of the border with Egypt. But it hasn't yet sent its battalions into the overcrowded streets that are now home to half of Gaza's population. Most people sheltering there have already been displaced, some of them multiple times. The growing pressure on Palestinians there is once again forcing an exodus. The United Nations says around 300,000 have left Rafah just in the past few days. But the potential Rafah attack has proven a red line for Israel's key supporter, the United States. It's paused some shipments of munitions and is threatening to stop further supplies. The U.S. believes an attack on Rafah would come at a huge cost to civilian life and also doesn't believe it will achieve Israel's stated aim of wiping out Hamas.
Israel shouldn't launch a major attack into Rafah without accounting for and protecting the civilians that are in that battle space. And again, as we have assessed the situation, we paused one shipment of high payload munitions. And again, I think we've also been very clear about the steps that we'd like to see Israel take to account for and take care of those civilians before major combat takes place.
In a further sign of a shifting U.S. stance on Israel, the U.S. State Department released a report last week that said Israel's use of U.S.-provided weapons in Gaza likely violates international humanitarian law.
Nevertheless, given Israel's significant reliance on U.S.-made defense articles, it is reasonable to assess that defense articles covered under National Security Memorandum 20 have been used by Israeli security forces since October 7th in instances inconsistent with its international humanitarian law obligations or with established best practices for mitigating civilian harm.
Still, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his right-wing government have repeatedly said a Rafah invasion is inevitable, and he's prepared to see it through with or without U.S. support.
In the War of Independence, 76 years ago, we were few against many. We had no weapons. There was an arms embargo on Israel. But with our great spirit, heroism, and unity, we won. Today, we are much stronger. We are determined and we are united in order to defeat our enemies and those who want to destroy us. If we have to stand alone, we will stand alone. I have said it before. If we have to, we will fight with our fingernails.
But if there's one clear example of how futile Israel's aim to wipe out Hamas is, it's in Jabalia, a refugee camp in the north of the Strip. After spending weeks bombing the area, Israeli tanks are once again conducting airstrikes and a ground operation, which is killing civilians. They say it's to stop Hamas from re-establishing military capabilities.
We don't know where to go. We have been displaced from one place to the next, and now we have left. We don't know where to go. We are running in the streets. I saw it with my own eyes. I saw the tank and the bulldozer. It is on that street.
So, Israel says it will, but can it continue to pursue its strategy without real consequences, if even Washington is issuing condemnation? Well, joining me now to debate that and more are from Tel Aviv, political analyst and contributor to Haaretz, Akiva Eldar. From London, former Middle East advisor to the U.S. Department of Defense, Jasmine El-Gamal. And from Washington, political analyst and lecturer at George Washington University, Nizar Farsakh. Thanks all so much for being with me. Jasmine El-Gamal, I'll start with you. You know, we've been reporting this as the U.S. not quite handing Israel an ultimatum here, but finally criticizing Israeli action in a way we haven't seen before. Do you believe that's sincere, or do you think it's just strategic, especially going into a presidential election cycle where the Biden administration has been struggling with its position on Gaza?
Thank you so much for having me. First of all, it's a pleasure to join you today. I don't think the U.S. move is strategic, and I think that's largely in part because the pause that they just announced is really not significant enough to make any sort of difference in Israel's campaign in Rafah. So it comes across as being kind of the worst of all worlds. They're not quite putting enough pressure on Israel to stop them from going into Rafah, and also they're angering several elements of the U.S. public and the international public as well. They're trying to appease both sides. They're trying to appease, and by they, of course, I mean the U.S. It's an election year. The stakes are high, and so they're trying. President Biden's trying to appease both the supporters of Israel and the supporters of stopping the war and of a ceasefire, and he's not quite reaching either one.
Interestingly, I mean, I do find that strategic, though, in that he's trying to play both sides. It might fail. It might not seem very smart, according to certain analysts, but is that actually what he's trying to do because the election is coming? And the U.S., you know, the position on Gaza has proven disastrous, especially with the protests we've seen in the U.S. and how they're gaining momentum in the lead up to November.
You know, and when I say I don't think it's strategic, it's not that I don't mean it's not deliberate. I do think that President Biden is deliberately trying to appease several different sides of the electorate, but I don't think it's strategic in the sense that we don't see a long-term vision for this, whether it's the way that Biden wants to approach voters in the U.S. and how to speak to them and how to explain to them his administration's actions, or the fact that the Gaza operation itself and the entire war does not have any profoundly obvious strategic aims. There has been no post-war planning, neither by the U.S., neither by the Israelis. Of course, whenever either the U.S. or Israel tries to say, well, we'll bring in an Arab force and the Arab countries will pay for the reconstruction, you'll hear the Arab countries saying, wait, we don't want any part of this. We didn't ask for this. And so the strategy is missing. And so that's why these moves, in light of the fact that a strategy is missing in the long term, these moves don't appear to make a lot of sense.
Okay. Nizar, I could see you agree there, but let me ask Akiva. Akiva, do you think the U.S. and the Biden administration is recognizing that they have a real liability on their hands because of this endless, staunch support for Israel? And with the Rafah invasion seemingly imminent, they could have, a true liability that they might have to take more responsibility for.
I agree with Jasmine that what happens now for the United States, it's a lose-lose. They were hoping to have maybe win-win-win situation to reach a comprehensive agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and to bring Saudi Arabia on board and complete the Arab Peace Initiative that have been waiting on the shelf since March 2002. But they didn't take into account that Netanyahu cares solely about his local consumers. He needs to please his partners in the coalition, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and he is willing, and I really hate to say this, he is willing to sacrifice the interests of the Israeli people. And I'm saying this in the eve of the 76th National Anniversary Day of Israel. There is an article today in Haaretz written by his former economic advisor, Professor Kendall, that says that if Netanyahu will still, and he was working for Netanyahu, that if there will not be a 180 degrees change in the policy, we will not be able to celebrate our 100th anniversary, Independence Day.
That's frightening.
And I think President Biden understands that there is a difference. Maybe there is an abyss between Netanyahu's personal interests and Israel's interests. And what should worry us is that the enemies of Israel, and even paranoid people may have enemies, are starting to think that Israel's strategic weapon, which is the special relationship with the United States, the image that Israel actually controls the United States, it's a kind of constructive anti-Semitism. This is fading away. And Egypt made peace with Israel. Saudi Arabia is willing to make peace with Israel because they believe that Israel can deliver the White House. And the Iranians are watching us and having a good laugh.
Okay. Nizar, if I can come to you and returning to a look at Rafah now. If Israel invades Rafah and it just causes that terrible harm the U.S. is warning about with no post-invasion plan, where will that actually leave Rafah and Gaza? And will there be any real consequences for Israel in it?
Well, it definitely would just make the situation worse. Building on what Akiva just said, it's not strategically smart for what's good for Israel, but it's correct. Like, Netanyahu does not care about that. Netanyahu only cares about his own survival. And unfortunately, he's been exceptionally effective in manipulating the Israeli, political system, cajoling the right, because he knows that's where the main support is, and feeding that beast of making Israelis think that a complete defeat of Hamas is possible, which is not the case. We have now, for now, we have 20,000 Gazan orphans. I don't think these people are going to be anything but new Hamas recruits, right? So what is happening is trying to go, or it seems the Israeli government is trying to go for a short-term gain of looking like they defeated Hamas because now all of Gaza is destroyed. That is, mission is completed because Rafah is the last city remaining. Maybe, if they're lucky, get Sinwar or get the hostages or some of them, something that they could call a victory, and then deal with the consequences later. And this is what the U.S. administration has been pointing out, is that that's what we did in Iraq, and we got horrible results. So that the entry point of the Americans is also because the U.S. needs Israel to win. If the war ends now, Iran won. So it looks extremely bad for the U.S. And again, as Akiva said, it shows that the two countries, Israel and the U.S., are not on the same page, which also degrades the U.S. geopolitical weight.
But let me ask you, Nizar, because you had noted, if Israel continues on this path, you seem to believe they will intentionally draw in other parties, not least Iran, especially if Israel foresees maybe Donald Trump taking power in January, and then they will have their ally right back by their side.
Of course. Bibi has been explicit in praying that the U.S. gets sucked into a war with Iran. Now, one thing to bear in mind is you cannot overstate the shock that the Israeli public got from October 7th. And the fact that a group that was besieged for 17 years was able to do so much, has been fighting 7 months now, and even in places that were cleared by the Israeli army, the real scare is Hezbollah. If Hamas is able to do all of this under siege, you can just imagine what the kind of damage Hezbollah can do. And therefore, there is a general consensus in the military and in the political echelon that leaving Iran and Hezbollah intact is going to put Israel in a very weak position. And therefore, since they already have the U.S. in the region and they're not likely to get such an opportunity to have so much investment by the U.S. In the region, their chance to hit Iran is closer now, unless there is, of course, a Trump administration.
Jasmine, right now, The U.S. Has also issued this report saying Israel is using U.S. weapons in breach of international humanitarian law. First of all, help us understand that. Why would the U.S. commission this report? Is it kind of preemptive, perhaps, to protect itself from liability because it is supplying weapons to a party that many believe are committing war crimes, and with the invasion of Rafah looming, those crimes could become more severe?
Well, the US has its own domestic laws regarding the use of its weapons that it sends to other militaries and the use of those weapons. So, for example, there's the Leahy law, which means that which basically says that if there are any foreign military units that are committing human rights violations with US weapons, then those weapons should be stopped until that unit changes its behavior. So these are US laws. The US is obligated to follow them. And one of the biggest criticisms of the Biden administration from critics of the war and of the US position towards it is the fact that the US hasn't been following its own domestic laws regarding these weapons transfers to Israel and the use of the weapons. Now, this is a really tricky issue, of course, because the way that President Biden set up U.S. policy towards this war from the very beginning gave him very little room to maneuver in the coming months. From the very beginning, after October 7th, and Nizar is right, it was such an incredible shock and such a tragic event, obviously. I mean, that's an understatement. And so the response of the Biden administration was to say there will be no daylight between the U.S. and Israel. We are completely behind them. They have to win this war. They have to eradicate Hamas. They have to make sure October 7th never happens again. You know, when you start with that kind of positioning, anything that you do afterwards could be seen as a withdrawal of U.S. support for Israel. And it's something that President Biden's critics are really pouncing on him for, with Senator Lindsey Graham, for example, being one of the loudest voices, whereas the U.S. is just trying to get the Israelis to think strategically about what you're doing in Rafah. What is it actually going to get you? What are the risks? And what are you going to do once this war is over? Now, they're doing it in a clumsy way, but again, to restate, these are U.S. laws, and the U.S. is obligated to follow them. Although I will state that the report fell short of saying that that Israel has violated international law using U.S. weapons. It said that the U.S. was concerned and painted a picture of grave concern, as they said it in the report, but they didn't go quite as far to say something that would make them compelled to stop those weapons shipments to Israel.
Right. Painted a picture of it. Okay. Let me ask Akiva, though. I want to touch on some of the other peripheral, I guess, players involved, and the fact that we now have Egypt supporting South Africa in its genocide case against Israel. Does that tell you anything, or is that just kind of a minor move where Egypt can also maybe be accused of trying to play both sides?
Well, Egypt is in a very delicate position because they have to try and find out what exactly President Biden is willing to do. How far is he able or willing to risk his political chances to win the elections, to use his leverage on Israel? Egypt will not go ahead of the United States. They need the American aid. They may, I will even guess that before they made this move to follow South Africa, they got a kind of at least a yellow light from Washington that they can go ahead. President Biden has already used whatever American presidents have did before in order to tell Israel enough is enough. Like Secretary of State Henry Kissinger warned Israel that in the 70s, that if Israel will not agree to the disengagement in the Syrian and the Egyptian border, there will be a reassessment of the relationship. And this was enough for Yitzhak Rabin to go ahead with the agreement. Now, we have to also mention Jordan. Jordan, I think, is one of the weakest part in the equation here because of the political and geographical stands for on the border. They have Iran, Iraq, and the regime itself is fragile because of the Palestinian majority in Jordan, and they are very close allies to the United States. The tiebreaker here, the game changer, can be only if it comes from the highest echelon in the army.
Okay.
I'm not talking about a military coup, but we get in the last few days clear messages that the army cannot keep on going into Rafah and risking lives of soldiers where there is no exit strategy. Netanyahu is not willing to say what will be the day after. Okay, we took over Rafah. The army is controlling Jabalia. But what's next?
Right.
Do we stay there forever?
Akiva, let me ask you that, because yes, we're seeing Jabalia attacked again, even though Israel said it had cleared the northern Gaza Strip of Hamas fighters. Has Israel, you talk about, the possibility even of a military coup, has Israel really had any success in achieving its stated goals then? Or is the goal just to eliminate Gaza, and then the army has to be entirely on side with that as well?
Well, I can remind you that what convinced Prime Minister Sharon to leave Gaza, to disengage from Gaza in 2006, was an interview of all the former heads of the Israeli Secret Service, the Shin Bet, that were actually warning that if Israel will stay in Gaza and confront, this was the Bush administration, if Israel will not follow the American roadmap to peace, Israel is risking its existential interest. And Sharon has left Gaza. Unfortunately, he left Gaza without any agreement with the Palestinian Authority and threw the keys to the street where the Hamas picked it up. But Israel is still a democracy. People are taking to the streets every day. And we didn't mention the Israelis who are still in those rebels, inside the rebels, and are dying every day, the Israeli captives. And Netanyahu is actually using them in taking no responsibility for their future, just lip service. And he knows that as long as they are there and there is no agreement, no deal with the Hamas, he's safe. He cannot stop the war because he promised us that he will have the ultimate victory.
Nizar, I mean, and then final question. Will there be at least a ceasefire? We just saw it fall apart again last week when it seemed they were closer than ever. And it almost became, I don't want to say a joke, but there's just no prospect for it. And then there's, of course, the second question as to if there's any post-war plan that we will ever see.
Sure. I mean, ultimately, the war is going to end at some point. But building on what Akiva just mentioned, the main challenge, like internationally, right, with everybody that's engaging Netanyahu is that he's not reliable, right? He does whatever he wants, and he keeps breaking his promises, and he keeps lying. So a big frustration for the U.S. administration and Biden specifically is that Biden's type of diplomacy is about, giving a bear hug, showing that there is no daylight between the U.S. and Israel, in order to have currency to be able to influence the Israeli government. And after 6 or 5 months even, he realized that he can not rely on anything from Netanyahu. And likewise, the Egyptians and the Jordanians, that's also their frustration, is that they do not trust that Bibi Netanyahu is going to keep his word. So on the side of Egypt, they're very concerned about the Israeli army being on the Philadelphia corridor, the breach of the agreement, and the amount of refugees they're going to get. Jordan is petrified of, the fact that the Israeli government has many cabinet members who believe that Jordan is Palestine. So with such, unlike where I wanted to get is unlike Sharon, who, regardless of what we think of him, was a pragmatist. Here is a person who was the head of, or the spearhead of the settlement movement, dismantling settlements in the Gaza Strip because he believed this is what is strategically important for Israel. And he listened to his advisors. He understood that and he did the right thing. Now, for the ceasefire, I think that the minimum is some optic of Israel winning, some optic of Hamas losing. I do not think that there is going to be some mention of a day after, but I agree with you. I don't think there is anything that's thought through, nor that this Israeli government cares about that. They're very myopic and short-sighted.
Okay, Nizar, that will unfortunately have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers, because we are completely out of time. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.